Hello and welcome. I'm testing the sound. Can you hear me, Natasha?
Yes.
Okay. And I've got hers way down just for now. So today is our last seminar of the year, the 2020 year, not the academic year. And we have Natasha Unsworth, and she is I believe it's 2016 graduate of this department. She double majored in environmental studies and writing. And she's been doing a lot of interesting things. She went to Boston University, got a degree in science journalism, worked at the Yale School of Medicine doing technical writing, and now she's a doctoral student at Texas Tech. And she's going to talk to us about science communication in a pandemic era. So now I'm going to turn up her volume and mute myself.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Sorry, you're muted, but are you able to hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. All right. So should I go ahead and share my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see if this works. All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be virtually, at least, back at Calvin University. Thank you very much to the GEO department for this opportunity to share part of my path from GEO over to Texas Tech University over the last almost decade, and where it's brought me in terms of my learning and my research. My name is Natasha Unsworth. I am a former student of Calvin University and Boston University, as well as a current student of Texas Tech University, where I'm pursuing my PhD. Because I'm working on a PhD, I'm also a researcher studying science communication. I also consider myself to be a science communicator, though I haven't written much for the general public since starting my current program. The reason I'm still a student, even 9 years after beginning my education at Calvin, is because I am curious. I'm especially curious about misinformation, and that especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, when true information is especially vital. But I'm also curious about science literacy and illiteracy and overall public perceptions of science. I hope you're a little bit curious about these things too, because I'll be sharing some of my research in these areas shortly. For a little bit of background, this story of my curiosities begins right where many of you are sitting right now at Calvin University. I began my time there enrolled in the first year research and earth sciences class, which gave me my first real taste of scientific research and the scientific method in a setting that really makes use of it to come to conclusions. This picture here is one that I took out on the dunes during one of my years participating in FIRES. After I was a FIRES student, I also went on to be a mentor for the program and then its coordinator. I was also a member of the first Van Rieken Creation Care Floor, the GEO department, and Calvin Chimes, where I spent a stint as the science and technology editor. I ended up majoring in environmental studies and writing both. All this is to say that I belonged to communities that emphasized science, discovery, creation care, and above all, the awe that seems to connect all of these things together. I've been learning a little bit about awe as an emotion in my current studies and realizing that it makes for an excellent draw to continue learning. It helps you remember things that you have learned, and it inspires continual questioning. So my experience at Calvin, in short, formed an excellent groundwork for continuing education, which I did at Boston University. If you're a current Calvin student and considering pursuing graduate school, I'd be happy to talk about that process. I will mention that I can't imagine a better preparation for graduate school than an education at Calvin, and it doesn't hurt to mention the interdisciplinary nature of a liberal arts education if you're looking into and preparing applications for graduate programs. My own program of study at Boston University was in science journalism. It was a one-year program, so it was short but sweet. And in the course of it, I learned to observe and communicate science, but this was to a science-curious audience primarily, in a very science-saturated city. So Boston is a hub for biomedical research, and a lot of the researchers' stories that I put into words were geared toward readers who already have an interest in and understanding of the science that they're reading about. The program was a lot of fun, and it went by in quite a whirlwind, but it was also a great preparation to put learning into practice in terms of the mechanics of science journalism, the whole process of researching a topic, tracking down and interviewing scientists in that field, and then weaving together research and narrative and interesting quotes into a cohesive and hopefully interesting whole. The next stop for me was a stint of putting that learning into practice, writing for Yale School of Medicine and Yale Center for Clinical Investigation. So I started out with an internship at Yale Medicine Magazine and the Medicine at Yale newsletter, and both of these publications were geared towards School of Medicine alumni. So while the language was more conversational than what you'd find in a typical peer-reviewed medical or science journal, this was still communicating medical science to medical scientists. The stories were kind of niche, but they were written in such a way that a general audience could understand the science involved and could get a sense of the life of the researchers featured, but most general audiences aren't really seeking out those sorts of stories, even though they are comprehensible to a general audience. After my internship, I spent a year writing for Yale Center for Clinical Investigation, and that was a bit of a change of pace because despite the clear science focus of the center as a whole, while I was there, I was writing for a much more general audience with less of a focus on science and more of a focus on human experiences of participating in clinical trials. The narrative series that I worked on there was called Help Us Discover Heroes. And its main goal was to demystify clinical trials and debunk some of the fear that there is around participating in them. So these stories were mostly individuals' life stories, stories about how a disease maybe took over their lives, and they then found hope in participating in a clinical trial, or about how they volunteered their time to participate as healthy controls, to learn about the process of clinical trials, as well as helping researchers and those who have these diseases alike. So the science was there, but it was really backgrounded to narratives of human experience. And all of these stories, science stories for scientists and human stories for general audiences, really have their places, and they're all incredibly valuable. But it got me wondering whether we can have it both ways. Specific scientific stories that feature human researchers' experiences, but are also geared to a more general audience. And there are certainly stories like this. We see them frequently in National Geographic and The Atlantic, as well as sometimes in the New Yorker and the New York Times, and probably many other publications. But I'm also curious about how many non-scientists read these stories. I'm curious really about how many people who are not scientists themselves are curious enough about science to pick up science stories in general audience publications and read them. And that curiosity is part of what brought me to Texas Tech University. I'm really interested in knowing what roles narratives and awe play in spurring science curiosity, engagement with scientific information, and retention of that information. But it turns out I was thinking a little bit too big, because a study looking at all of these factors is the work of years. And you have to hit the ground running in a PhD program, or at least this one, and get started with a bunch of smaller studies, maybe focusing on one or two variables before you can dive into these really big, all-encompassing ones. So I started my program right in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, which actually presented an opportunity to run a study looking at one specific question. What do people know, and what do they think they know about COVID-19 itself? I wanted to see in a small sample of individuals how the pandemic communication about the disease causing that pandemic was being absorbed and perceived by various audiences. I also had the opportunity to explore the question of how people perceive climate science communication, and specifically how the abstractness of language they use in describing climate science is related to how close or far they perceive the problem to be for themselves personally. So the first real study I was able to carry out at Texas Tech was an interview study investigating the perceptions of COVID-19 among small samples of individuals in Lubbock, Texas, San Francisco, California, and New Brunswick, New Jersey. We began the study with the aim of discovering more about what sorts of understandings and misunderstandings there are about COVID-19 out there in the general public, a little over 1 year into the global pandemic. So we came up with the following research questions. First, what are the most prevalent understandings and misunderstandings of COVID-19 in our sample populations? And second, how complete is the conceptual understanding of COVID-19 among these same populations? We used 2 research methods to answer the 2 research questions. So for question 1, we conducted semi-structured interviews with our participants. There were 27 of them, 9 from each location, asking what they knew about COVID-19. Then we had those interviews transcribed and did a content analysis of them, coding them line by line to pull out the key themes and determine the most prevalent understandings and misunderstandings of COVID-19. And then for research question 2, we constructed mental maps to visually depict the conceptual understandings that several of our participants had. And I'll show those maps to you in just a few minutes. What we found though was that the top theme by a wide margin was personal experiences. Almost every participant referenced his or her own personal experience when they were talking about COVID-19. And these recollections mostly took the form of narratives. So I have here one of the narratives in the participants' own words. By the way, all of the names used here are pseudonyms. These aren't the real names of any of the participants. Francine said, "I'm not a scientist, but I can't help but compare it to polio because I grew up with that scare. And even though there were problems with polio vaccines, people very much believed in getting vaccinations to eradicate it. I believe in vaccines because I've seen how it can eradicate things. I think that younger people who didn't grow up around polio and that kind of thing, they don't appreciate that." The next most common themes were, in descending order, vaccinations, uncertainty, and science communication, each of which was referenced more than 85 times between the 27 interviews. So on vaccinations, Iris said, "My husband and I, we are both older people, 75 and 76, and had the devil of a time getting vaccinated. I'm very happy that we got vaccinated. I was looking forward to it. This view was not universal in our samples, and I'll explain a bit more when we get to some of the other themes. Some of our participants had uncertainty about the utility of social distancing, about whether surface spread of COVID-19 was a concern, and the wide range of symptoms. So one of our participants, Helen, was skeptical that the death toll from COVID-19 was as high as recorded because, quote, "I'm just confused as to how the same virus could affect so many people in so many different ways." On science communication, there was a range of beliefs, but distrust was among them. Heidi said, "There's definitely so much information, so much misinformation, and you definitely got to blame the media for that." While not among the top mentions, there were additional themes that we wanted to explore, distrust and misperceptions, as these are both significant focus areas for science communication in a pandemic context. So distrust, when we encountered it, was mainly directed at government agencies like the CDC and the NIH, and especially the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases within the NIH, Dr. Fauci, as well as toward the COVID-19 vaccines and China. Helen had said, "Dr. Fauci says one thing and the CDC says something else, and then they changed their minds. I refused to read it all because it was just too conflicting, and I thought maybe they're being a little sensationalistic." Heidi told us, "The vaccine obviously was rushed through, which was a little worrisome. I'm upset in the first place all this happened because it shouldn't have even got out of China. I've spoken with someone who works in a lab, and she was pretty sure that even the scientists that came up with COVID-19, they're trained here in the US. And we basically have taught them what to do and how to do things like this. And supposedly it was going to be tested on a little village in China, and it got out." That unsupported theory leads nicely into the theme of misperceptions. These were mostly directed at the vaccines. Ideas that they're not effective, that they were rushed and therefore unsafe, and that they hurt fertility. One of our participants, Irene, is actually a science communicator by training and by trade, and she told us about some misperceptions that she had encountered among her acquaintances. She has some friends and acquaintances afraid that, quote, VAERS, or the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, is showing all these deaths due to the vaccine. And I have to explain to them, this is not a verified source of information. Anybody can publish what they want into it. We additionally summarized some of our participants' understandings of COVID-19 visually by constructing concept maps from their answers to the main question, what do you know about COVID-19? And the follow-up questions that elaborated those initial answers. The first map I'm going to show you is visually overwhelming, but in a weird way, that's exactly what we wanted to see, because the more complex the map, the greater the understanding demonstrated. So this participant has an understanding of COVID-19 that's both broad and deep. Upon being asked about COVID-19, he immediately listed 11 things he knew about it. And on further questioning, it was clear that he had in-depth knowledge about most of them, as indicated by each subsequent level of the concept map. It wasn't surprising that this particular participant had so complete an understanding. He's actually a toxicologist and teaches toxicology and has closely followed the news on COVID-19 throughout the pandemic. In contrast, this next participant had a relatively shallow conceptual understanding, offering just 5 general concepts. It's an infectious disease that went through so many countries, claimed so many lives, caused economic disruption, and is marked by the symptoms of fever, shortness of breath, coughing, and sneezing. That last one wasn't actually a recognized COVID-19 symptom at the time of this study, but there has since been the suggestion that it may be associated with the Delta variant. This next participant, Halim, was one of our few Generation Z participants, but also among the participants who had a strong conceptual understanding of COVID-19. He understood that it's a novel form of a coronavirus. He reported that part of the reason the vaccines could be developed so quickly is that coronaviruses are old and have been studied for a long time and have been around for even longer. He correctly identified COVID-19 as a viral infection, differentiating it from a bacterial infection by saying that viruses aren't technically living and therefore aren't killed by treatments, but rather more like disabled by them. He also noted that viruses can't be disabled by antibiotics, but rather prevented by using vaccines to train the immune system before it encounters the viral pathogen. Even more specifically, he indicated that this viral infection is caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and he knew that the virus is harbored in the nasal cavity, and that this is why COVID-19 tests use nasal swabs, and that it is spread via particles expelled in respiration by breathing, coughing, and sneezing. He mentioned that it causes long-term effects, including long-lasting breathing and heart problems, as well as suspected additional negative effects that are currently being researched. So it was really encouraging to find some thorough understandings like these, especially when we were also seeing some of the misperceptions mentioned earlier. The main caveat for this study is that we had a really small number of participants, so it really only gave us a snapshot of some of the narratives, perceptions, and understandings that were out there at one specific point in the pandemic. So we can't generalize our results to whole populations or other time points, but we did really want to see which narratives we could find, knowing that if some people are saying these things, they're out there. I'm also currently enjoying the opportunity to collaborate on a project that investigates climate science communication and how it's received by its audiences. So more specifically, we're looking at how and whether the abstractness of language that individuals use relates to their psychological distance from climate change as an issue of relevance to them. So this project has a bit more relevance also to my environmental studies background. So I wanted to briefly share a bit about it, though we're still in the analysis stage on this particular project. But for some background, climate change is among the most daunting and seemingly intractable threats to human flourishing all around the globe. Its effects are being felt as increasingly frequent extreme weather episodes, rising temperatures and sea levels, wildfire events and droughts. Even so, the personal importance of climate change is doubted by 33% of Americans, according to Duan et al. And Chu and Yang have demonstrated that psychological distance separates many individuals from grasping the scope of the problem and its relevance to their own lives. The perception of what risk climate change poses to individuals is strongly connected to how close they perceive the threat to be, or in other words, their psychological distance from it. Psychological distance refers to the degree of mental remove that an individual perceives he or she has from an issue based on physical, social, temporal, and/or hypotheticality factors. Physical factors include perceived physical closeness of climate change, such as whether you live in an area that you would perceive to be affected by climate change. Social factors include whether individuals have the perception that climate change is having big impacts on people like them. Temporal factors include individuals' perceptions of whether or not climate change is having a current impact. And hypotheticality factors are things like perceived probability of experiencing climate change effects, how likely you think it is to affect you. Risk communicators are understandably invested in discovering how to accurately convey the facts of climate change, but also how to determine whether their messages are being received as intended. So we turn to psychological distance to look into making sense of climate change communication and how that communication is received by individuals. Because psychological distance has been found to co-vary with language abstractness, such that greater psychological distance tends to correlate with more abstract language, we took this understanding as our model and then set out to investigate whether it is possible to infer from the abstractness of individuals' language just how great their psychological distance from climate change is. That is language abstractness a viable means of estimating an individual's psychological distance from climate change? If it is, this could inform how we conduct content analyses of public comments made, for example, in response to climate change communications. So if we can infer from the language use in these comments just how psychologically near or far climate change is perceived to be, it could shape how we approach communications in the future. We would perhaps aim to emulate those communications that tended to elicit more concrete comments, indicating reduced psychological distance, and try to avoid those communication tactics that draw out more abstract comments that might imply increased psychological distance. While I don't have results to share with you quite yet at this point, I did want to draw the curtain back a little bit on what the earlier stages of a research project look like as well. And also to illustrate that if you really enjoy research, you might consider continuing on to a graduate program in your area of interest, because it opens doors to a lot of research at a lot of different stages all at once in a variety of topics. I found it to be an exciting and rewarding endeavor for myself so far. Thank you so much for your time and also for the opportunity to share some of my research experiences with you. I've included my contact information here if you'd like to follow up on anything that I discussed. And I'm also happy to take any questions you may have at this point.
I am going. It's a brave new world. Figuring this out. Natasha, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so she's there. It's just questions from the audience. I'll see how this works. Paul, go ahead.
Are there any publications that you think are like good that we should, like, you know, probably read into more about science communication?
Did you catch that, Natasha?
Just the first part, something about quotations.
He's looking for publications about science communication that you'd recommend.
Oh, okay, for a general audience or in terms of peer-reviewed publications?
General audience.
I really like pieces in The Atlantic when they come up and The New Yorker, even though their focus isn't science generally. Whenever they do have a science piece, it seems to be worthwhile. I also don't know if you've heard of AEON, AEON. That's a free publication that covers a variety of science topics. And Nautilus, which isn't a free publication, but they let you have a couple free articles a month, and that one's interesting as well.
How much did you catch of that? Did she say Atlantic and Nautilus? Sorry, we're having this. Neil.
Yeah, I was wondering, what are some examples of the abstract language that typically people refer to
He's asking, what is this abstract language about climate change that you referred to?
Right. Okay. So there's the coding scheme that we're using for that study is borrowed from a coding scheme that they used for visual data. So we adapted it. But for example, in the hypotheticality dimension, people who are making predictions, like saying in the future, or this will be the case, or they're saying that this might happen. Those sorts of things are more abstract than emphasizing current effects. Also, things like describing the effects of climate change would be more concrete than talking about the cause.
Say, Mark.
Yeah.
I just want to check back on a false question. Are you asking more about piece of writing that would talk about the process of science writing?
Oh, no, just general.
Examples?
Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions? Here comes one.
Was there a pattern seen with the knowledge about COVID based on age, or was the sample not big enough to explain that?
Good question. Yeah, so for a more quantitative study where you have thousands of participants, you can draw connections like that. You don't want to do that for a qualitative study that has such a small sample size. So really the whole point of this project was getting snapshots of what narratives are out there, but we didn't have a large enough sample to draw conclusions about any of those sorts of connections.
How large would that sample have to be?
How large would a sample have to be able to draw those conclusions?
To go to the literature with solid.
Sorry?
To go into the literature with a substantiated answer. How big would that need to be your random sample?
I'll just repeat. The question was how large of a sample to get more of a quantitative sense of these things.
Oh, okay. Yes, that's very dependent on how many variables you want to look at. For a small study that could still draw those conclusions, you would want about 100 participants per variable that you're looking at. So if age is a variable that you're interested in, you'd need 100 in each age category that you're looking at. And same with if gender is a variable that you're interested in, you'd want 100 males and 100 females.
We have a comment, just very interesting, from Isaiah Hogman. He very much enjoyed listening, has lots of ideas to take away.
Oh, thank you.
This is Deanna Van Dyke. I've got a question through Zoom. I am wondering if there would be a couple of lessons that or tips that you could give for current scientists and how we could better communicate things that you've been able to draw from your research, or are you at such a different scale that it's hard to tell us how to do a better job on this?
No, it's a great question. And that's actually one of the main questions that brought me to graduate school in the first place. I wanted to figure out how to do that myself. Just small snippets. I mean, a lot of scientists have been trying a lot of different things and misinformation persists. So it's a bit of a puzzle. The research seems to suggest that concrete language is helpful. Drawing connections that people can relate to is helpful. I know Catherine Hayhoe, who's here at Texas Tech, spoke at the January series last year, and she's been looking into a lot about, for climate change specifically, to reach the religious groups that are often the most resistant to it, draw connections to the things that they tend to care about, and indicate how that is related to climate change.
Thank you.
Natasha?
Yeah.
In today's Environment and Energy News, there was an article that
instead of emphasizing the Green New Deal, Democrats are going to focus more of their messaging on climate change on extreme weather that affects people in specific places. Would that be consistent in terms of approach, like what you talked about, the hypotheticality?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, especially in terms of combining the temporal and the spatial dimensions, if people are aware that, you know, this is a risk to them personally because of where they live, it sounds promising.
When I read it, I had a little bit of a reaction because I tried to, when I taught those things, I said, well, this is global climate change, not local weather events. And
Right.
so I was pushing the abstract, I guess.
Which makes sense. I mean, that's what the science is telling us. But for communication, we've been trying that for a long time, and it's not always certain what's working and what isn't.
Any other questions? Well, let's try a virtual applause. Thanks, Natasha.
Thank you.
Awesome job. Okay, great. Thanks for coming. And bearing with my technical foibles. Only have cameras on here. That was.
Say, Natasha, I'll ask you another, oops, I'll turn on my video as well to be a little bit more friendly about that. I'll ask you another question as they're winding things down. What's the relationship or maybe the proportions between the responsibility of the scientist who's communicating and the kind of the way the audience is hearing? Because communication has the two parts to it, right? So,
Definitely.
Last one. Thank you. Well, hello.
so can you have like a scientist who's a great communicator, but there are some audiences that just won't hear it?
Hello, Natasha?
Yeah, hi. To answer the question, yeah, that really does seem to be the case. I mean, we saw it a lot more during the pandemic, I think, than maybe with other issues, but especially when you get into conspiracy thinking, there's it seems completely unreachable populations. Just it doesn't matter what you tell them, they're keen to find something that they think neatly explains everything without having them needing to rely on authority figures.
And so then there is nothing that the communicator can do, or
I mean, I think it probably depends how far down the rabbit hole the person has gone.
okay.
I want to say that there must be a way to reach them. I'm not sure what it is yet.
Right. So then I guess the follow-up question is, if you've got an audience that is made up of the whole variety from people who are very interested to people who are very far down that rabbit hole, is there kind of a central zone to which you target your communication?
I mean, the thing is, the interest is there on both sides. I mean, people who go down these rabbit holes are very interested. They spend a great deal of time looking into these things. From what I haven't researched this specifically, but from what I've seen in the news, it looks as though sometimes what can help is knowing someone who gets severely ill with COVID. And then that person gets the vaccine and, oh, they survive it. So their friends and acquaintances might be more convinced by the experience of people they know.
And I
By any
guess
chance, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Deanna.
I was going to say that that's kind of a slow process, and it involves a lot of people getting ill in the meantime.
Right. We hope there is a better way.
Right. But that comes back to, I think, your very first point, which was that personal narrative was so influential, right?
Right. Yeah, it's influential and it's prevalent. I mean, it's a pretty universal way that we communicate. And it helps us remember things as well. Narratives are a lot more memorable typically than other forms of communication.
Natasha, do you know the work of Chris Arnaid?
Chris Arnaid?
Yeah, he's an interesting writer. I don't really know too much. He's a photographer writer. He was I think he worked for Merrill Lynch in New York City and retired in his 40s, very rich. But then
I'll have to look him up.
he's been photographing kind of the forgotten America, what he calls back row America. And he has he walks around cities and photographs the kind of forgotten neighborhoods. But he had a Substack article I just saw, it was about 2 weeks ago, and it was called Life Among the Unvaccinated.
Oh.
And he interviewed and just like has conversations in bowling alleys, very blue collar places. And he kind of tried to understand this, and he realized, Dr. Fauci isn't going to be able to communicate to these people. Doctors aren't going to be able to communicate to these people. It's someone who's on a bowling league with them, someone who's in their kind of personal world is the only one who could communicate. And,
right.
and so,
yeah,
it was very interesting.
No kidding. Yeah, I think one of the hallmarks of these communities is that they have a certain distrust of authority.
And yeah, exactly. He was saying it was a way of owning the elites was to be unvaccinated.
Right. Yeah.
And he said it's a hill some people are willing to die on.
Yeah, literally.
To own the authorities, the experts.
Right. I'll have to look him up. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, I spelled it wrong. Okay, I just typed it in, and I'm going to sign off here. Thanks so much, Natasha.
Thank you.